Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have a really inspiring conversation with the designer and educator, Aggie Toppins. Aggie is currently on the faculty at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga and maintains a really fascinating studio practice where her work and research focuses on active citizenship and intellectual pursuit. In this episode, Aggie and I talk about how she discovered graphic design as a child and then why she decided to go back to grad school after a successful career working in graphic design. We also talk about how she started teaching and how being introduced to critical theory completely changed her own practice and why it's now important for her to introduce this kind of thinking to her own undergraduate students. I was first introduced to Aggie's work because she is also an alumni of MICA, where she finished her MFA a few years before I did. And as you'll hear in this conversation, our experiences and careers have had a similar trajectory. So I really loved getting the chance to talk to her and found her enthusiasm completely contagious, and this conversation just so interesting. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. These memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this really inspiring conversation with Aggie Toppins. You know, I kind of want to start, though. I don't really know anything about your background at all or how you kind of got into this. And so did you study design? How did you get interested in graphic design?
Well, maybe I'll start with the background and how that led to design. I'll do it that way.
Sure.
Okay, so I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. And I don't know if you've been to Columbus, but
I've driven through it.
Yeah,
I grew up in Indiana, so I'm familiar with the Midwest.
Yeah, so Columbus is a big city. It's broad avenues, a lot of like chain businesses.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an everywhere USA. You know, I think it's often used as a test market because it's such a sampling of everywhere. You know.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
But I grew up. I was raised by my mother with some help from my aunt and my grandparents. And I grew up in what you would say is a low-income family. Like, we struggled financially. It was very hard at times. And so I think I share that because I think it has some impact on the way I teach and think about design. But I remember, like, always, like, kids love to draw, right? My mother really cultivated that in me, though. I was thinking about this the other day because, I don't know, something brought it up, but when I was a kid, like, we didn't have a lot of money to do things or like go places, or we didn't have like tons and tons of toys. So I drew a lot of pictures. I read a lot of books.
Yeah.
And my mom would do this thing where she would cut pictures out of the newspaper and bring them to me and ask me to make up stories about what I saw in the pictures.
Oh, wow.
And I hardly remember this now, but we've talked about it since, and it's kind of funny because this is a similar activity that I do with my sophomores now, like, where we talk about, like, look at this image and let's talk about how we derive meaning from this image, So even before I can remember, she was kind of cultivating a visual literacy.
Oh, that's great.
So as I was growing up, I just always thought I would do something creative. I really loved school. I wanted to go to college really, really bad. And I thought about it all the time as a child. I loved like looking at maps and reading about other cultures. And I started studying French when I was a kid. Like, there was this show on public TV that I watched and I was learning words. And then I went to a public school where I could learn French when I was like 11.
Oh, wow.
So I was trying really hard to become a knowledgeable person despite kind of having some kind of economic constraints,
Mm-hmm.
Public schools in Columbus are pretty great. And I'm really glad that I grew up around people who were like lots of different like backgrounds from me.
Yeah.
And it's something now I value a lot because I teach in a state that, struggles with equity and diversity.
Right.
But growing up in a city where there were always people in my class that looked different than me and spoke different languages, and I really value that now. So I kind of felt like I always wanted to do something that was like intellectual or creative, but nobody in my family, like I was such a black sheep in that way. So, I don't know. I remember the first time I heard about graphic design was from someone like at church, maybe.
Okay.
So, I was really interested in what that was. I made little books at home and, I drew letters sometimes because I thought they looked cool. So, like you do these things as a kid and you don't know why.
Yeah.
So I visited someone that I went to church with at her job. She worked at a company called Fitch, which at the time had accounts with like Hush Puppy shoes and stuff like that. So this would have been like 1995-ish.
Okay.
I was about 15. And I visited her company and I saw like it was the coolest place I'd ever seen. It was big and open and clean. And all these people had workstations where they were drawing, and the computer was relatively new in our field at that time. I mean, it was still people figured out how to incorporate it, into professional work. So she had this beautiful Macintosh on her desk and all these markers, and she was drawing like tiny images of horses. She had like maybe 50 little drawings of horses on her desk.
Yeah.
And I was looking at those horses thinking, I'm going to do this for a living. Like, this is what I want to do. Because she had a great living and she looked very happy and she was doing things that I did for fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like my grandmother washed dishes in a hot hospital kitchen all day. Yeah. My grandfather had like mangled hands from a plastic factory. For me to think that I could like get a job drawing horses was like a huge life moment. So I thought, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be a designer. And I went to a fantastic arts impact public high school in Columbus called Fort Hayes.
Okay.
I had, it was a great school. It was also a college prep school. So my academic classes in undergrad were a lot less challenging than my studios were. But I took painting and drawing and printmaking and computer graphics. Had a wonderful art teacher named Mr. Walton, who was just so fun. And I sang competitively. I loved music, but like I couldn't buy instruments or anything like that. Right, so I just started singing, and I took foreign language and stuff like that. And all of those things kind of come together. If you're interested in language and you're interested in visual form, like graphic design is a great field. Yeah. For you, So I went to college at the University of Cincinnati, the College of Design, Architecture, Art, and Planning, which most people affectionately refer to as DAP. So I went to DAP.
Okay.
Like it's the same school that Michael Beirut went to. Yeah. So he's like our, golden alumni person. But when I went to school, it was like a huge deal for my family. I was a first-gen college student. I moved away when I was 18, and I remember it being so hard. I mean, I loved it, but it was so hard. The studios were like the hardest classes I'd ever taken. And I was my high school valedictorian. I was very used to rigor. Yeah. But I was like floored by how hard the studios were. And I remember like just it was a challenge to just like pay for it, I worked like sometimes 3 jobs on top of school. Oh, wow. In addition to having scholarships and loans. So I teach students now who are kind of like the student I once was. They're working really hard. They're often first gen. And so it just brings me a lot of joy to kind of, I don't know, like I can kind of empathize with them a little bit. Like I know what they're kind of going through. Yeah. So I don't know. That's part of why I like teaching where I teach, because I kind of like get it, So DAP was a very modernist program. And I don't know what your undergrad was like, but ours was like super Swiss. Yeah. My professors were educated by Paul Rand at Yale and Armin Hoffman in Switzerland. And so we were taught the kind of modernist ethos, It was a Bachelor of Science in Design. It was not a BS. Yeah. Yeah. So, we were like a hair's breadth away from wearing lab coats type of thing. Right. Like it was really logical, methodical. There were things that were designed and things that were not. There were rules. And, I'm kind of grateful for that too. I mean, it was a discipline in which I felt like I learned a lot about craft, and, but it was also the kind of thing where there's so much we didn't talk about that kind of shocked me later after school. Yeah. I remember reading, I don't know. I worked in the DAP library too, so I looked at like Critique magazine and like yeah, that back when Critique was
Yeah.
still around.
Yeah.
Print and I also read art magazines like Parquet and stuff. But I'd be sitting at the circulation desk at like 9:30 at night reading the magazines, and I would see things like David Carson, and I was like, "What is this?"
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
We didn't talk about stuff like that in class. So I knew there was more to design than what we were getting in that moment, but I was still really kind of grateful for that kind of discipline.
Right.
And then when I graduated, one of the things that was nice about that program was there was a pretty strong internship aspect to it. So I had about a year and a half of experience when I graduated. So I was able to get a junior design position right away. I worked at an environmental graphic design firm for a couple of years. And it wasn't, I see why people love it. Like one of my good friends from school is an environmental graphic designer, Chris McCampbell, but it wasn't my thing. I learned a lot about like materials, and I learned about shaping an experience, like how a person enters a space and encounters a space. But ultimately I wanted to do like image making and work with typography, and I was still really excited by the kind of narrative potential of brand identities and printed work. So I was looking for something else, and I really wanted to move out of Ohio. I had the lust pretty bad. So I moved to Chicago when I was 25, and I got a job at a company called SGDP. Okay. And they changed their name to Simple Truth Communication Partners.
Okay, that sounds familiar.
They're in Chicago. They're an interesting place. It was a wonderful job at first. I got to do all the things I had hopes to do,
Oh, nice, yeah.
I got to work on annual reports for nonprofits that did veterinary research, and one of my clients was the Chicago History Museum. So stuff like that was just really, really fun. But eventually, I became like a little more senior. I became a senior designer. I was there for 5 years.
Okay.
And the time was coming for something new. The recession had hit.
Right.
Things were changing. And I thought there were so many things about design that I hadn't experienced yet. Like I wanted more education. I wanted something else, and I just didn't know what that was yet. At the same time, I was mentoring students. I was working with students who were in undergrad, just to kind of let them know what the profession was like. And I really liked that, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why I liked that.
Yeah.
So I thought, I think it's time for grad school. I think it's time to maybe revisit my education. I was considering maybe teaching and not maybe like creative director life.
Right.
I was more interested in maybe. And I remembered, like, why did I get into this? I was excited about ideas. I was excited about experimentation. And I kind of like lost touch with that a little bit working in the field.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was just time. It was time to like get back,
I mean, before you move on, there's so much of this story that sounds so similar to mine, actually, and in a couple different ways that I thought was interesting was your undergrad education, which I've been thinking about my own undergrad education a lot lately, and it was also very Swiss focused, but I don't know, maybe this is not something that I should be like trying to work through while we're recording. But I've been thinking about this a lot. I don't think it was ever defined as you're learning the Swiss style. Like, I don't think that word was used to define it. It was just, this is what graphic design is. Like, this is how you do it. Yeah, this is the right way. And I don't know why. I've just been thinking about that a lot lately, and I like ate it up. I was really good at, like, I loved setting grids and doing all of that. And I think kind of going so deep into following those rules has ended up kind of influencing the way my work has moved away from that later.
Yeah, me too. Totally.
And is exactly, that's how I, just like you again, was able to kind of get a job right away, work my way up, and then had this moment where it's like, wait a minute, this is not what I got into this for. And so how did you arrive that grad school was kind of the answer? Like, when you kind of hit that moment or started thinking about that, what was it about?
There were a couple things. School? Yeah, there were a couple things that influenced the decision. First, I I was starting to feel like I didn't know enough about how to experiment. That sounds kind of silly, but I don't think that we were really taught to think that way. There was a right way, and you do that way. Yeah. And I was really good at that way, that sort of like method of that we were taught. But I wanted to like think about how I made work more, and I wanted to have more methods and more resources to try and make with more diversity in my work. I felt like there was probably something I hadn't done yet, that because I didn't know myself enough. Like we weren't taught to cultivate practices. We weren't taught to have a voice,
Right.
We were taught, to be kind of like chameleons in a way. Like you twist and bend visual form and give them content to serve something, serve a client, serve something.
Yeah.
And I remember when I thought I wanted to go to grad school, I thought I have to write a statement and I don't even know what I care about. I care about this, but what is this,
Yeah.
So I looked at everything I had made and I started looking at my favorite projects and trying to draw out of them what attracted me to them and piece together some kind of application. Yeah. I was drawn to MICA, I think, because for lots of reasons, I felt like just really at home there. Like the professors were really just really committed to us and really wanted some kind of mentorship that way.
Yeah.
But I also felt like it was the right place to figure myself out.
Yeah.
Like lots of places to try new skills or all kinds of skills that I didn't have that I wanted to get from experts. So I took lots of typopography, but I had never taken any lettering. And so I took lettering with Ken Barber and Ben Keel. And I never did any printmaking. So lots of silk screen and letter pressing. But I was also really interested in like motion and interactivity and what does code do? And super excited about learning new methods. I had never done anything field research wise. I've never done any of that stuff in my career. So I had an internship at IDEO between the first and second year of school. Wow. I learned some methods from that, the limits of those methods as well. But it was an interesting new set of things to think about. I was a part of the Center for Design Practice at MICA, which was so about like how do you build criteria from the situation you're learning from, like not being an expert but being a learner as part of being a designer. Right. And I was really interested in, like Keitra Dean Dixon taught there for the 2 years in school. And I'm like super grateful that those 2 years overlapped because she's a huge influence to me. But I was really interested in material exploration and in like procedures and operations. That was like a big shift for me to think about things like that.
This is a weird question, and it might be a little bit of me kind of projecting my story onto your story a little bit, but did you, as you were doing these experiments and as you were kind of going through these, learning new processes and methods, and even before you got to MICA and were just thinking, I want to go back to school, this job I'm in, this kind of career that I'm in right now isn't what I thought it was going to be or isn't doing what I thought it was going to be. Did you ever have a moment where you thought that maybe graphic design wasn't the right thing? Like maybe it wasn't graphic design that you wanted to do, or that maybe the problem wasn't like the career, like the job you were in, but was actually with quote unquote graphic design?
Yeah, I wondered if I should go to an art program. Yeah. Like the thing is that I just love graphic design. I love the stuff of graphic design. Yeah. I love the history of it. I love the values. I love the stuff of type and like synthesizing it with image. And I love design. I love the way it looks. I love the way it smells. So I felt like this is the language that I use. I just want to use it to give form to my own thought. I don't necessarily want to give form to someone else's ideas right now. Mm-hmm. And, there are a lot of different ways of looking at authorship. And I'm really interested in authorship generally as a subject because there's so many different ways of thinking about it. Yeah. And so many different ideas historically about authorship. But I value that a designer's voice can be through the presentation of something. I totally value that. Yeah. And sometimes that's what I do. But I'm also really interested in just having my own ideas and writing about my own ideas and making the arrangement on the page and making the thing. So I just needed some more, some time to develop that, I guess. Mm-hmm. Graduate school is also where I learned about critical theory. And I'm a
Okay.
little bit embarrassed to say that because it's something I love so much now, but didn't even know was a thing
Yeah.
until I was like 30. So that's why I'm really interested in introducing it to my students, because you shouldn't be 30 when you learn about critical theory.
Yeah.
I don't think. If you are a trained agent of public imagery, you should not encounter critical theory for the first
Yeah.
time when you're 30.
So how'd that happen?
Well, it happened in Ellen Lupton's class.
Okay. Okay.
So MFA
That's what I
student,
assumed.
yeah, here's Roland Barthes.
Yeah.
And I read The Death of the Author, and I was like, where has this been my entire life? Like,
Yeah.
what is this writing? I didn't even know I could think about this. And that led to just a hunger for that kind of thing.
What was it? What was it about? Sorry to cut you off. What was it about that you were like, oh, this is this thing that I've been missing?
I think it was, this is why I'm seduced a little bit by this discourse and why I am eager to share it with my students. It also came out a lot in my thesis work. I read a lot of critical theory in my thesis work. I like critical theory because it is an examination of the things we assume to be true. It uncovers mechanisms around truth.
Yeah.
And it helps, it sort of like gives me language and gives me like a method for thinking about something that otherwise I would have a poverty of terms. I'll give you an example. So my thesis project in grad school was an exploration of the American funeral. I was very interested in why do we do funerals the way we do. I have always personally found funerals to be really like just not meaningful, just not special, not a reflection of the feeling, not something was wrong with funerals. And so I learned a lot of things during my thesis that populate my practice now, like reading about the history of ideas about something. That's a really important thing that I do now that I didn't know about before grad school. So I read about, American rituals. I read about the history of the funeral industry, right? And how once industry kind of entered the picture, how that kind of changed our understanding of this ritual. And I was starting to read anthropology as well, case studies in other countries about what a funeral is like, how people memorialize a person, kind of ritualize this thing. And then I started reading about things like the spectacle. And I started reading about things like simulacrum.
Yep.
And so it started with Baudrillard, but then I quickly moved on to Deleuze and Guattari, and oh my gosh, that stuff is. If you don't know that that's a thing, you just look at it and go, why is this so weird? Why is this so
right?
What's wrong with this thing?
Yeah.
So theory has been a way to take the blinders off a little bit on some things, maybe question assumptions, or a theory has also provided me, I think, with some kind of conceptual armature for what I'm dealing with as a designer. And I don't know, the thesis was the first time where that kept happening over and over. Sometimes I think you read something in theory and you think I see this as a process. I can see this as a sort of generative process.
Yeah.
Like when I read about deconstruction, like collage is a really ideal language for kind of playing with deconstruction, right? Yeah. So there's definitely links between what we do as designers and the kinds of stuff that you read about in theories of language and theories of society. So
I want to keep talking about this, but I want to ask another question to kind of better set up kind of this role of theory, because again, I think our kind of stories or interests are very parallel. Where I was like aware of critical theory and knew the names of these people, but had no idea how to begin. And that's what grad school was for me. And halfway through, I guess it was probably halfway through I guess it was the second semester of my first year, I added that as a critical theory as a concentration, because I just got so obsessed with it. It sounds like kind of similar to you. But before we talk about that a little bit more, so when you finished at MICA, did you know that you wanted to get into teaching, or how did teaching really then become such a big part of what you do?
Yeah, I had a feeling that I wanted to teach when I
Okay.
started grad school. I just didn't know when it would happen.
Yeah.
I thought I should probably be older or something, or I don't know.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I didn't really know what would happen.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the MFA students, I was like a GTI for someone,
Yep. Yeah.
and I did that for a while. And then I went to IDEO for an internship, and I liked that experience because I learned a lot. But I knew that I didn't want to work there. I knew that wasn't
Yeah.
what I was going to try to do after school. And it was almost like, I don't know, fortuitous in a way. Like Brockett emailed me and asked me if I would teach graphic design 1 that semester.
Okay. Yeah.
And I was like, okay, let's try it. I don't know what I'm doing. I had like a week to figure it out.
Yeah.
And I loved it so much. It was ineffable. I could not explain to you why I loved it. I think it was just exciting for me to think about graphic design as a whole field
Yeah.
instead of like the thing I did at work,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was exciting to share, something you just kind of love with people who are trying to learn it.
Yeah.
And I was really excited by meeting students and learning about what they wanted to make. So it felt right. And, you apply for academic positions like December-ish.
Right.
And I thought, well, let's see what happens. So Brockett was a super significant person to me. She is a huge mentor for me, Brockett Horn.
Yeah.
And I talked with her a lot about teaching, about methods of teaching. I showed her my application. I applied for a lot of jobs, and then it was a good year for that. There was just a lot of graphic design tenure track positions.
And when was this?
During my thesis.
Okay. But I mean, but what? How long ago was this? Yeah.
It was 2011 turning into 2012. So I graduated in 2012. Yeah, I began teaching in 2012.
Okay.
At UTC. So I was interviewing for jobs while finishing thesis. Yeah, it was kind of wild.
Yeah.
At the time, Christian Bjornard I was taking an elective with him, and he's a good friend.
Yeah.
I was taking an elective with him, and I just kept having to not be there so I could go to these interviews. And I was like, Christian, you can technically fail me. And he's like, should I? It was kind of a funny thing between us that he could prevent me from graduating.
That is amazing.
But, we're friends, and he was very patient with my absences. But so I was lucky, and I had a couple of options. Mm-hmm. And I chose UTC because it was such a good alignment with what I cared about as an educator. And I'll tell you, it was really comforting to know that I had an exciting new challenge after school was over.
Yeah.
And I felt really good about it. Like I was excited about it. Yeah. So I finished school and we moved to Chattanooga, and that was a whole new set of adventures. The first few years of teaching for me was kind of like decompressing graduate school.
Yeah.
And because it's so hot and fast, and it's like 4 semesters of chaos, and then you think to yourself, what just happened? Like, what did I just learn? And what am I going to do with the pieces now? And you feel like you've accomplished something, but at the same time, it's what you do with it in the next stage of your life that is kind of the ultimate test, right?
Right. Yeah.
At the same time, I was learning to be a teacher. I taught also in the spring after I had gotten my job. So and in the summer, I taught pre-college at MICA too. So I had only 2.5 semesters of teaching experience before I started a tenure track job.
Wow.
So it was definitely a lot of on-the-job learning.
Yeah.
But it was really exciting. I mean, I had a lot of control over my classes. That's part of why I love our program. I'm one of 2 graphic design professors. So I work really closely with my colleague, Matt Greenwell, he's been at the university longer than me. He's older than me, but we have a really great working relationship. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's a lot of, really in simpatico.
Yeah.
And he was like, how about you teach these classes? These are the classes we have. How about you teach these? I teach these. And he didn't even give me any prior syllabi or anything. He was just here. At the time, he was actually the department head, and he stepped down my first year so that he could come back. We could rebuild in a way, or read graphic design together. And so we've had we just had a really great working partnership for the 6 years. This is my 6th year, so for 6 years. And, he was really like, I could talk to him, like, I'm trying to work this thing out, and we could work on things together.
Yeah.
In some ways, he was a really great mentor for the tenure process. And yet he trusted me with my own expertise. So it was a really good situation, to develop a teaching practice.
I mean, I'm sorry that I keep just like highlighting the parallels in our careers, but it's really funny to me because it was the exact same thing that Brockett emailed me in the second year and said, and knew that I was, I kind of was interested in teaching. I had, when I was in undergrad, one of my professors kind of said offhandedly to me, like, you're going to be a teacher, right? And so that was kind of always in my head. And Brockett emailed me my second year and was like, do you want to teach a class in the fall? And I think I had like 2 weeks to kind of put everything together. And it was like this kind of immediate, oh, this is exactly the thing that I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And the thing that is interesting to me, it sounds similar to you, but I'm curious what you think about this, is that for me, teaching and the classroom are the place where all of the things that I love about graphic design actually come together in the clearest way, where it's making and practice and aesthetics and visuals, but then it's also critical theory and writing and criticism, and then it's talking about this thing that I love so much, and all of these things come together, and that doesn't happen anywhere else for me.
Right. Absolutely no point in my life when I worked in the profession did anybody go, oh man, you're making something like that, you should read Foucault. It happened.
Yeah.
So, it's sort of like, if you're excited by ideas, if you like just love ideas and love the potential of them and the power of them, academia is a great place to be.
Yeah.
Because you're really like engaging ideas, but you're finding ways to map those ideas onto like the stuff of your own field, right? Your type and image and stuff like that.
I'm interested in why you decided to jump basically all in academia and not kind of do the adjunct thing and go back to kind of a regular job or start your own thing or do like, what was it? What were you thinking of kind of, this is going to be my main thing now?
Yeah, I definitely was done with commercial practice. Okay. I mean, I still did some freelancing when I was working towards tenure. But I didn't want to work for like a company anymore that's just doing like one thing in design. I wanted, like you were just saying a second ago, the classroom, and maybe like even outside of the classroom, like your professorship, your identity as a professor is a convergence of many things. And I was really interested in that challenge.
Yeah.
I only taught adjunct at MICA, and I don't exactly know why I thought, let's make the leap. I think I wanted to just see what would happen.
Yeah.
I applied to jobs, not totally sure that I would be qualified for them, but I wanted the experience of seeing a campus visit. I had the attention of our esteemed faculty at MICA to coach me.
Right.
And, it just, the opportunity was there.
Yeah.
And so I was like, let's do it. The time's here.
That's great.
And I'm really grateful for it. I mean, UTC is, it's not like a top ranked school or anything, but it is exactly where I want to be.
Yeah.
I love my students. I love the kind of culture we have. I work with people who I feel really philosophically aligned with. And it's an institution that supports us pretty well.
Yeah.
Like our research is supported pretty well with grants from the institution. And, Chattanooga is not a place I ever thought I would live. I've always lived in big cities up north.
Yeah.
But I like living here. This is a city that, if you're interested in, another thing we haven't really talked a whole lot about, but is important to me is how do you use your work to be a more active citizen?
Yeah. I wanted to talk about this, so this is great.
Yeah, Chattanooga is a great place for that because it's small enough that you can see the impact of your work. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of civic energy. People want to be part of being there. Right. And it's like every city. It has some problems. We have equity and diversity problems. We have a lot of people who economically suffer. Mm. We have all kinds of interesting urbanism issues with growth, and I get to be part of those conversations in a really public way. And I don't know if I've ever lived in a city where I felt so involved with what's happening in the city. So maybe it's just because it was the time in my life when it's time to start doing things like that.
Right.
But in Chicago, the problems are kind of like wicked problems. And you might be able to do things as part of an organization, or you might be able to do things in your neighborhood. But in Chattanooga, one person can impact the whole city.
Right. Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting thing to think about.
And so is that kind of work your kind of primary, I don't want to use the word commercial work, but like that's the type of kind of design work outside of teaching that you do? That's kind of the main thing now?
Kind of. I mean, I don't know if I have a main thing, and there's something I'm trying to figure out.
Okay.
So I also kind of feel like a constant prototype.
Oh, I love that.
I love the way Keatradine Dixon talks about her work, because she talks about it as like a work in progress, you know?
Mm-hmm.
She'll say, I don't know if you've listened to her talk about her work, but she'll talk about the things that she's done and how she arrived at new plateaus in her practice.
Right.
And she talk about where she is and where she's going. And I'm always like, sometimes you listen to people talk about their work and they seem like they have it all figured out and they totally know what they're doing. And I don't. Does anybody ever really know what they're doing?
Yeah.
You know, so I kind of like the honesty of just saying, you know, I'm a prototype. Like, this is a prototype.
I love that.
So where I am right now, when I finished school and came to Chattanooga, I had no clients. I had no idea what I was going to do, but it was like a clean slate kind of thing.
Yeah.
Lots of things came up during the thesis that I knew I couldn't like take on during the scope of that project.
Yeah.
Lots of little things here, like I want to explore that later. I want to explore that later. And so just to be active as a studio practitioner, I started reading things and making things just based on like the sort of loose ends from thesis.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then I started building up a client base, and I worked with clients for like primarily probably as my practice for the first 5 years that I was here. And, you know, the reason why I did that, this kind of, I don't know if this is a good thing to say or not, but the reason why I did that is because when you're on a tenure track, you do have to prove to the institute that your field validates you, that you are being peer reviewed somehow. And my institution accepted client commissions as original knowledge. So client commissions, that was a very clear way to start building a professional profile. Those things qualify for design awards too. I don't know if I care that much about design awards, to be honest. I don't.
Yeah.
But they are a way of demonstrating to the institution, see, my work has been validated by my field. So I was able to, you know, rack up some things like that. And I guess I thought to myself, this is interesting. I'm getting to know people in my community, but this isn't what I want to do, really.
Yeah.
I started building up what I would call an independent practice. Some people call it a personal practice, but I don't really like that term.
Yeah.
Personal practice is like, oh, I designed some labels for my, I don't know, my like DVD collection. I don't know. like that's personal, where it's actually just used by you. But I was more interested in graphic design as the language for giving form to my thought. So what am I thinking about, and what am I making in response to that? The challenge is where to put it afterwards, because it can't just live in your studio or in your head. And so I started building an exhibition record. And there are a lot of problems with exhibiting graphic design, and I'm, you know, engaged in that discourse too. But I also found, like, sometimes what you make can go in a gallery. Sometimes it can sit there and be a good, you know, it's a conversation. It's, you know, sometimes I started making a lot of little zines at first, just to like make something to like process what I was thinking about. And I've always been really interested in practices that are kind of like unprecious daily activities or routine activities, because it just keeps you generative, you know? So I started making zines, not really knowing if I was ever going to show them or do anything with them. And eventually people were like, those are like good somewhere.
Yeah.
And so I kept doing it. I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll show these in a show or go to an art book fair or something. And that became kind of a part of my work.
Yeah.
Then it became a way of demonstrating peer review. So then there were kind of like two divergent practices. There was like the independent work and then the client work.
Right.
And I was having a lot of trouble making those things converge for some reason. And after tenure, I got tenure last summer. I thought, now is the time to think about what I can do with this privilege. So tenure is a gift that allows you to take risks.
Yeah.
I don't have to like win design awards every year. I don't have to like chase those things anymore. The gift of tenure is, what risks do I take now? I can use several years to do a project. I can do something more ambitious.
Right.
And that's what I'm trying to figure out now. I I'm not doing client work so much anymore. I am interested in communities, though. I am interested in like being the person at the table who is the designer on some kind of public, multi-organizational effort.
Yeah.
I've been involved with some efforts in the city to help voter turnout, and also I'm working against voter suppression in Tennessee. So Tennessee is 50th in the nation in terms of voter turnout.
Oh,
and
wow.
It's an issue, and we have a lot of voter suppression happening, like disenfranchisement, for example, where if you go to prison, you don't get to vote anymore. So I've been working with different organizations in the city to try and use communication strategies to give people information, just like how to get back their rights, how to get to the polls, and that's something that I guess like there's an aspect of that counts as peer review, but I'm doing that because my heart needs me to do that.
Right.
So having this is a way that I can just be a citizen,
Yeah.
And then I still I have a studio practice that shares traits, I think, in a lot of ways with what a contemporary artist does. I go to my studio, I make things, I sit and stare at the walls sometimes. I have practices, I have like methods that I attend to, and sometimes that adds up to a larger body of work, and that work gets shown.
Right. Okay.
Or published somewhere.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about that a little bit, and then hopefully use this as a way to bring back in the critical theory and kind of connect that to the classroom a little bit, because the first, I don't know if you would call this I don't know if you call these zines or not, but at the New York Art Book Fair, I saw your critical theory cocktail little booklets. And so I guess I kind of have two questions around that, or maybe one question around it that can lead to a bigger question. But what I thought was interesting about those, and is something that I think about a lot, I think you and I have talked about this on Twitter a little bit, is how do you make critical theory accessible? How do you make it so like thinking about my younger self who knew that this stuff existed and it seemed like something I'd be interested in but didn't know how to get into it. And the critical theory cocktails seem like a really good way to do that. And so I'm curious how you think about that, both as like part of your practice and how that fits into your practice, but then also as a educator, how you kind of introduce these things to students.
Yes. So, I'll tell you a little bit about that project, and then I'll move into the bigger questions.
Great.
So that project started because I really am interested in food histories, food rituals, and crafts.
Yeah.
I was on a road trip with my husband, and I was really into theory. I don't even know what I was reading at the time, but I was digging into something, and we were learning to make cocktails at home. Okay. And just it was kind of like a light bulb moment. Like, what if we brought these two things together? Because
so good.
I thought it would be fun for me to do something in terms of like writing something and making something to help me process what I was reading.
Yeah.
Because these are challenging. The ideas they're really interesting, but they're also like really complex.
Yeah.
So by having to make something in response to it was a way of making sense out of it, or what sense can be made out of it. Mm-hmm. So again, it was the project existed to be generative, to sort of like learn things. But, and I didn't, it was almost like I thought it was kind of a dumb idea in a way, but it ended up being interesting to people. Books have really caught on. People seem to like them. So now, I'm working on a 4th issue right now.
Oh,
so
great.
It's hopefully going to be another one soon. But it takes a long time to think of cocktails, and it takes a long time to understand and read theory. So they come out like every year or two.
Yeah.
But the question about accessibility, I think this is a really important thing. And I know that we've talked a little bit about, can undergraduates read theory? Mm-hmm. Some people don't think that undergraduates can understand theory. I'm not saying that you do, but a lot of people say that to me. I meet them at conferences and stuff, and I just don't think that's true.
Yeah, I agree.
I think I would have loved to have read theory in undergrad. But it isn't a matter of reading it and completely 100% understanding it. In fact, even philosophers who have PhDs and don't understand it. It's not about whole understanding. It's about engaging the ideas, because because ideas are interesting and lead to other ideas.
Yeah.
I tell my students, we have my very first class in graphic design, sophomore studio,
Yeah.
an image making studio that is couched in semiotic theory. And they have to read, Bart's mythologies. And we start with Bart because I think Bart is really accessible. He's a beautiful writer. Yeah. It's still challenging for the students, but it's not impenetrable. It's not Deleuze. It's not Derrida. It's a lot easier to read. And he's just such a lovely writer. I sometimes reread his paragraphs just because I like them.
Yeah.
But I tell the students, why do we read challenging texts? Part of it is because if you start reading challenging texts, then they become less challenging at some point in time, right? One of the professors I teach with at UTC, she's in philosophy, and she's become a friend of mine. I've actually taken 2 of her classes.
Oh, nice.
Her name is Talia Welsh. She says that reading philosophy is like weightlifting, is like the weightlifting of the mind. So if you're an athlete, you don't just go out and play a game. You train by like weightlifting and stuff,
right,
running or whatever. And if you're an artist or a designer, you don't just like make stuff. You have to like train your mind. You have to like get used to thinking about the world, right? Yeah. So critical theory is a way of thinking about the world. And I kind of already said this, but it examines what seems normal to us, what we assume to be true. So when students get a hold of that, they might not totally understand everything they read, but then we talk about it in class, and it starts to make more sense. Like, oh, there's a thing called cultural myth that I need to think about as a designer, or language is just a system. Language is arbitrary. Where does language come from? Language is fluid.
Yeah.
Started thinking about signs and just like mental models and assumptions we make, as a culture. And then I think inevitably, if you read a lot of critical theory, you start to question certain mechanisms of capitalism, and that's, I think, really healthy for a graphic designer. I think another thing that I love about introducing critical theory to students is that it's inherently intertextual, right?
Yeah.
So if you pick up Derrida, he's probably going to talk about like Rousseau at some point or Saussure at some point.
Yeah.
And if you pick up Zizek, he's going to talk about Lacan. So the students are learning to read in a way that's not just like reading an article.
Right. That's a really good point.
Yeah, they're learning to study the text. They're learning to circle things that they don't know what that is. And even if they just have Wikipedia open, don't know who, if they don't know who Freud is, what they do. They learn who Freud is. But let's say they don't know what Freud is. They just like look up his sort of legacy on Wikipedia, and now suddenly that paragraph makes more sense. Yeah. So learning to read like almost through the layers of a text, and that is a great life skill. Just beyond like caring about philosophy, that's a really important skill, because graphic design is an expanded practice. You have to be collaborative and able to think about more than one thing. You know.
How do you introduce these texts to the students? Are they tied to specific assignments? Are they tied to, are you relating them to works from design history, or kind of how does that fit into the classroom?
Yeah, there's a couple ways that this happens. Our program is very sequential.
Okay.
And I think I mentioned this, but so I teach sophomores through seniors. It's me and one other colleague. We teach all of our students, and we're with them for their 3-year journey. So these things kind of start in small doses and build. And then we have a class in our department that every BFA major takes called Critical Theory for the Visual Artist. Oh, wow. I don't teach that class, but I have sat in on it for a semester. Yeah. So I'm really aware of like what they're reading at certain points, like when my projects in studio fall. I know that
interesting.
So there's a little bit of like connecting the dots between what's happening in my studio and what they're reading in another class, because I know what they're doing over there.
Right, that's smart.
So a little bit is just like micro moments, like let's make a connection between that thing you read and this thing you're making. And I love to ask them, what are you reading in critical theory right now? Or what's going on in graphic design history this week? Because the way that I'm comfortable teaching is through a sort of mentorship model, where you put things in front of the students. You put opportunities in front of the students, and then you help them see their potential. You help them make connections. Yeah. That's kind of like the essence of teaching.
Right.
I think. So there's a little bit of that happening. In visual literacy, we read a textbook which was written by David Crow. It's called Visible Signs.
Oh, yeah, that sounds familiar.
It's probably the only textbook that I assign, because I'm a big fan of like multiple texts instead of one.
Yeah.
This text is good because he talks about all kinds of different theorists. He talks about Bourdieu, Saussure, all kinds of stuff in there. And so what often happens is the text will mention something, and I will give the primary text at the same time. So when we get to cultural myth, that he's talking about Barth and what Barth did, and then I give them a couple essays from mythologies. Mythologies is a great way to start out.
Yeah.
It's super accessible, short, and I love it because it's using language to kind of uncover, like take the blinders off of these things that we just kind of like absorb, you know? And it gets the students thinking about, it's just thinking about how signs kind of are maybe like the index of these larger cultural systems, I guess. So we start with Barth, and that's attached to projects that we're doing in visual literature. Some of those projects are abstract exercises, and then they move into things like book covers and pictograms and things that look like the stuff that they've seen before in graphic design. And then as they move into the upper division, junior and senior year, our projects start out with pretty tight constraints, but they're always designed to be open-ended. They're always, there's never like one right answer or whatever. The projects always result in a wide range of responses. Yeah. There's a lot of just like, if you're interested in this, you should consider looking this up. So there's a lot of like, in addition to what you're doing, think about this happening in class. But so as they move into the junior year, that's when they take critical theory, and the projects in studio kind of match up to the things that they're reading. We do an authorship project in which they have to present a text, and they can only be an author through the presentation of text.
Interesting.
Read the death of the author then. This is my junior class, which I didn't read that till I was 30. Yeah. So the students love it.
That's great. They
understand it. They totally get what authorship is, because everybody's a little bit of an author. Everybody's like on Instagram or whatever, Snapchat. Right. They're authoring stuff all the time. So it's not as unusual of a topic to them probably as it was a generation ago, right? Yeah. So they're working on a kind of motion graphics piece that involves presentation of a text. They're reading Barth, and they're also reading Michael Rock at that time. Right. That maps onto another project that we do is a kind of a process of building analogs, like forced connections between things, and they read some Foucault at that time. This is actually something I learned from Stephen Farrell at SAIC. He was a visiting artist, and I really liked the way that he married Foucault to a kind of a sort of intentional way of thinking. Our project is a little different, but they understand like why Foucault is important. They read this project in which we read a little bit from the order of things. We're talking about like how knowledge is grounded, like where does discourse come from? How does a history of a field, for example, like lend a sense of truth to the present, you know? Right. They read that at the same time as they're reading Discipline and Punish in critical theory. So they're getting like,
I'm so jealous.
I know. I wish I had had this too in school. So then, as we move through the junior year, there's stuff like that happening where there's like readings happening at the same time as projects. But then when they become seniors, and my colleague does this too, he'll give them like situationist international readings, and then they do some kind of connotative mapping project or something. And we are aware of each other's, assignments. So when they become seniors, then the projects open up entirely, and they're just making whatever they want to make. And it's a lot like a graduate level.
That's great.
Education. Yeah. The students propose their project for the year, essentially. It's at least like half of both the fall and spring semester. So it's kind of like a mini thesis that we call it a capstone. But the students design their own project. They make up their own thing. And the goal is that out of all the little things that they've engaged with up until that point, that they have connected the dots enough to identify an interest, right? I am interested in these things. So that's when it becomes really custom to the student. I see that you're thinking about how Pinterest conditions women to be healthy. You should read Biopower. You should read Biopower, and then you should read feminist responses to Biopower. Yeah. That's a Foucauldian thing, and it's accessible. That's accessible. Yeah. The students, the things that are harder for graduate students, I think, is when you start reading things like Deleuze and Guattari is very challenging. But the ideas are really interesting to them.
Okay. Yeah.
Assemblage theory is really interesting to them. Our students talk a lot about, I don't know if it's just because of the way my colleague Matt and I both work, like where we make like official looking things and then we make like zines and weird stuff
Oh,
too.
yeah.
But they're really interested in the relationship between like unofficial amateur, or I'm putting this in air quotes, amateur,
Right.
and sort of like the professionalized. They're interested in official and unofficial, like those
Yeah.
things.
That's
Too.
interesting.
That's like my jam. So, there's a point where we talk about territorialization. So how like a territory poaches the expressions of another territory,
Right.
which Deleuze would call deterritorializing, and then that sort of subculture has to like rewire itself.
Yeah.
And they see it all the time. Like if you think about 70s punk, right?
Yeah.
At one point in time, 70s punk was like, I'm against it all. I'm going to rip up my jeans and put safety pins in my jacket and hang out at this record store and listen to the Sex Pistols. Well, now you can like buy that. You can buy those jeans. You can buy that stuff to make your hair look like that at Hot Topic or whatever. Mm-hmm. So that's a classic, like, kind of example, right, of just the way capitalism sort of poaches the subcultural. Yeah. The students are so interested in that. I think because they're trying to figure themselves out, too, at the same time. Like, what is my identity? And then they kind of realize that identities are really flexible thing, you know?
Yeah.
So I think, the primary text is really hard to understand, and they'll look at it and then they'll come cross-eyed to class like, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
And the truth is that's kind of how I feel when I read it too, but it doesn't stop me. I'm sort of excited by that challenge, Yeah. And a lot of our one-on-one studio visits and conversations are just kind of like, what did you think about this part? It doesn't feel so much like, just kind of feels like two people who like ideas talking,
Right. Yeah.
The students make things in response to the discoveries they make.
Yeah. This is actually a really good way to kind of lead into my last kind of couple questions that I ask everybody. And I want to ask you the one question that I usually save for the very last question. I'm going to ask you make it the second last question.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask it in two ways because it connects directly to what we're talking about. I'm always curious kind of who the writers or critics that have really inspired people, and like who are the either the texts or the books that have kind of really influenced you. Mm-hmm. But I also want, so that's part A, but then part B, to kind of continue what we were just talking about, who are the theorists that you would recommend, and we've kind of been talking about this already, to a student or to someone who's listening to this that is kind of like what we're talking about, where they know this exists but don't know how to start. How would you tell them to like dip their toe into this?
Well, I'll start by saying, when it comes to, maybe I'll answer this.
Okay. Answer it however you want. Yeah. That was a weird grouping of questions, I know.
First, it's a little tough to say every student should read X, because every student is like a universe in and of themselves. Right. Depending on where that student is, what their background is, and what their interests are, maybe they should read one thing before another. But I think for what's good for graphic designers to read in terms of critical theory, I think they should understand Marx. They should understand Marxism first, because they are entering into the heart of capitalism, right? You're an agent of imagery. You may be tasked with branding, marketing, and selling. You should have an ethical underpinning in that approach. And that means engaging Marx first. Also means that you kind of have a basis for a lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
I think Bart is a really important person to read for students. And I think also, he's important to read not just because he's talking about language and he's talking about sort of like multiplicitous meaning. He's talking sort of authorship in a way which is interesting, but also not without its flaws. When I talk with my students about authorship, the question of privilege comes up a lot. Yeah. And I think that's a really important thing for a person to think about. But Bart is also so accessible that he kind of gets you hungry for more. It's a great way to start out. And then from there, I think a lot of people don't know if deconstruction is really so important, but I still think it's so important. Yeah. I really love deconstruction.
So do I. I'm so glad you said that.
And I think it's important because, you see it all the time, like in the media, the kind of like binary thinking that's out there. Are you this or that? Mm-hmm. Are you for us or against us? Like Derrida gives us permission to say, I am all the things. I think of all the things simultaneously. absence is a little bit presence, gray. It's all gray. And it gives us permission to kind of decenter our thoughts a little bit. And I think it's important, for people who, again, because there is a kind of ethical responsibility being a designer.
Yeah.
So I think those things are important. I also, and I don't know if this is a must do, but I think it's useful for students to engage theories of desire. Our students really love reading this essay by Zizek called Coq as objet petit a. It's in the Fragile Absolute. It's kind of beautiful because I don't know if you've seen any of Deleuze's films, but he often uses the example of Coke as like the ultimate commodity.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because it's empty. It doesn't quench your thirst. And then Diet Coke is even more because it doesn't even give you calories.
Right,
it's just consuming the nothingness, the void, But the idea is that and our students are also, and I think this is a lot of people, our students are very nostalgic, especially down here in the South. They're very nostalgic.
Oh, yeah.
But a discussion of desire and how desire is necessarily unattainable in a capitalist system is a really important thing to engage before you go out into the world and you're asked to sell things. I think you need to understand those mechanisms for whatever reason, however you decide to treat them, whatever. But I think it's important to know like how desire works, and how that maps onto even like things like memory and history and stuff like that. So I'm really interested in students understanding conditions of truth. And that seed can populate any number of avenues in a practice. The things I'm reading nowish, and I already have like a list for the summer, they usually correspond to what I'm dealing with in my independent work, but I have sort of two fascinations at present. I'm kind of working on a project which is not seen a whole lot of the light of day yet, but it's a long-term project that I anticipate will take me a few years to get to a point where it's publishable, if it's publishable. But I'm really interested in historical reference in graphic design, and I'm interested in theory being a link for analyzing that, being the kind of way that we unpack historical reference. I have been writing some things, I've been making some things, and I've been doing some pedagogical experiments. I have like students that take a special topics course with me, and they read things like they read Bruno Latour, they read they read a little bit of Derrida's hauntology theory.
Yeah.
We talk about, I really love this book by Svetlana Boym called The Future of Nostalgia.
I don't know that.
It's fantastic. I actually learned about it from Ian Lynham.
Oh, yeah.
To read it, and I wrote him later like, thank you so much. This has been important to me. It's a really great book. So I'm really interested in unpacking nostalgia because it's something we dismiss really readily. We're like, oh, that's nostalgic, blah.
Right.
So there's a lot to nostalgia. It's a very historical, cultural mood, and there's destructive ways of deploying nostalgia, and there's really productive and interesting ways that it's really kind of about the personal intersecting with the collective.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in having more critical teeth for those kinds of discussions.
Yeah.
So I've been reading about that. I'm also reading Benjamin for that reason too. I love Benjamin. Those things are also finding their way into my studio practice because I'm really interested in and I'm also really interested in the Situationist International. Like, how does the individual intersect with the cultural in terms of like cultural myth, rituals? I mean, that is directly from my thesis. It's just taking a different form now. So I read a lot of stuff like that, and it's coming. It looks different in different activities, but I think the sort of like, I don't know, my brain is revolving around the same sort of sun.
Yeah. So
that's where I am right now.
That's so interesting.
I will say that this summer I get to go on a studio residency in Mexico.
Oh, wow.
And I read a lot of, I'm just going to say it kind of bluntly, I read a lot of like dead French guys,
Yeah.
And I love the dead French guys, but I feel like I need to build on that with like some decoloniality and stuff like that. So I'm planning to dig into Mignolo this summer.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm also interested in a thinker named Manuel de Landa, who writes like the next stage after Deleuze. He writes about assemblage theory, but he's got a different life experience. So I'm really interested to kind of see. He's marrying that with like some more like theory of society.
Oh, interesting.
So that's gonna be my summer reading list are those two papers.
That's great. You started answering my final question a little bit, or we've kind of been talking around this question a little bit. But I'm curious kind of what you think are the issues or topics that designers should be talking about and thinking about right now.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. Our field is expanding so much, and I really think that's an asset to what our discipline is, what our field of knowledge is. I still want to see a place for studio practice. I still believe in form, visual, material form.
Yeah.
But what I'm really excited about that is starting to happen, and I would like to see happen more, is that graphic design discourse and the way we talk about our history is more inclusive.
Yeah.
We're including people who are non-Western, women, people of color, and people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. It's just really important to me that we reflect more of the world in our discourse. And that's starting to happen. And I'm really excited about the projects where that's happening. I hope someday that I can contribute to that, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that especially all the time just with this podcast, because it's still way too Western focused, and that bothers me. And it's embarrassing to say, but I don't know the best ways to broaden that scope.
Well, I think you've given hasn't Francisco Laranjo been on your show?
Yeah.
People who are doing that work have been on your show. So honestly, that's better than a lot of things,
Okay. Well, I was not saying that for a compliment, but thank you.
But I mean, I feel like I'd like to see more of that, and I don't know. I know when I started studying design as an 18-year-old who had come from a socioeconomic background that was pretty different than all my classmates. Mm-hmm. I remember thinking where is my slice of culture in this discourse? And
right.
I didn't really see it. So I learned later about unofficial forms of design and, blue collar sorts of design. And I'm interested in that too.
Right.
So no, I read things that are pretty I guess intellectual. I'm just really interested in the full scope of what design is from really abstract ideas to making lettering, just I'm really interested in all of it.
Right.
Yeah. And I guess that's what I think needs to, and that may be because that's my own interest, but I think that there's a lot of interesting criticism happening. I'd like to see more people reading it.
Yeah.
About it.
Yeah.
I guess that's how I would answer that question.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. I mean, this was so fun and this was so interesting to me. I feel like you said 20 things that I could just keep talking to you about. So thank you so much for your time in this conversation. It was so fun.
Thank you for thinking of me. I really enjoyed this, and I just really like this show. I want to commend you on, there's a lot of projects out there where people are let's talk to designers, but your project has gotten to a level of depth that I just think is really, really needed. So thank you.
Oh, that means so much. Thank you so much. This episode was recorded on February 27th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.